Good afternoon, viewers, for this second session, which will be on rural economic structure. जैसे मैंने आपको बता दिया पहले, ये खास तौर पर ब्लॉक 2 ऑफ MRD-101 जो कोर्स है रूरल डेवलपमेंट इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट का, द सेकंड ब्लॉक का एक भाग है रूरल इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर. Our this present session will be devoted to that part of the block 2 of rural economic structure, namely. I have great pleasure that we have with us for this session my friend Dr. Vikas Rawat. He is Associate Professor in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi, and has been in the field for quite some time now. In fact, you will be very happy to know he is the person who has written that part of our self-learning material, and I'm really lucky to have him with us for the same topic. His research, he has been doing a very extensive research on the issues in agriculture and rural development, and particularly the field-based researches which he has carried in West Bengal, in UP, in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, in Haryana, very extensive field-based research which has given him a tremendous amount of field experience, and he will be sharing a part of that with us. And in the teaching at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, he is particularly taking interest in agrarian development and development economics and statistics. All the three subjects he is teaching at JNU. I welcome you, Dr. Rawal, with us. Hello. And I'm very happy that you could spare time in spite of your, bad health because of the cold he's suffering. He is with us this afternoon, and you will be speaking to us on the rural economic structure. I now request you to please initiate your topic on rural economic structure.
Hello, everybody. Let me start by saying that I am going to deviate from the block that you have been given, the text that you have been given. जो आपको मटेरियल दिया गया है, मैं ठीक उसी के बारे में बात नहीं करूँगा, क्योंकि वो तो आपके पास है, उसको आप खुद भी पढ़ सकते हैं, और वो जो मटेरियल है वो बहुत सारी इंफॉर्मेशन आपको देता है रूरल इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर के बारे में, रूरल इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर किस तरह से चेंज हो रही है, हाउ इट हैज बीन चेंजिंग on various aspects of rural economic structure. I am not going to talk about all that. I will be talking at a much more fundamental basic level, also in view of the fact that most of you eventually are going to become practitioners of some kind. You may be working in NGOs, you may be working in cooperatives, you may be working in various kinds of rural development activities where you will be working with a rural community, with a rural society, and whatever work that you do, you will have to actually understand the economic structure in practice. You are not going to be so much of an academic. Your interest is not academic. Your interest is as a practitioner. So I'm going to actually talk about how, as a practitioner, and why should you be studying rural economic structure. So the whole presentation and this discussion, I would mainly sort of try and give you motivation about why should you study rural economic structure, and what is its importance in respect of rural development, and secondly, if how does one study rural economic structure? What does it mean? What is it that we are interested in? Now, to start with, what do we mean by rural economic structure? Economic structure consists of various economic classes. What are these economic classes? These are, say, groups of people who are identified by specific relationship with labor and with means of production. Let me take some time and explain what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that, let's say, a village consists of various kinds of people, various kinds of households, various groups of people who have a specific relationship with two things. One, labor, and second, means of production. Okay, means of production refer to land, which is the most important means of production in any village, because villages are primarily agrarian societies, and all the other instruments of production, plows, bullock carts, tractors, threshers, harvesters, all sorts of instruments of production. Basically all the means of production that are used for agricultural production and non-agricultural production in the village, all those instruments, all those assets which are used in that process, and most important of which is, as you would understand, land. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is the relationship of different types of households with labor. What is that relationship? So you would have some households which would cultivate land using their own family labor. Then you may have households which hire labor. Okay? You may have households which provide labor to other households whose members work as wage workers. And finally, you may have households which at some point of time in the year hire labor, and at other points of time are actually also working on other people's land. So, as far as labor is concerned, you could have various kinds of people with different kinds of relationship, people who are employers, people who are employees, and people who don't employ. And finally, people who are both employers and employees at different points of time in the year. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you first is that rural economic structure comprises of different types of these households, different groups of these households who have similar but different from other groups relationship with labor and relationship with means of production. Okay. Now, what is the importance of economic structure in the process of rural development? Why should we bother about economic structure? Now, rural development is embedded in the socio-economic context that is determined largely by the economic structure. Okay? Rural development, how it happens, the course of rural development, the form in which rural development takes place, the extent of rural development, and the impact of, let us say, rural development policies on a village society depends on the context in which these policies are implemented in the village, and that context is in a large measure determined by the economic structure. Conflicting class interests, that is, interests of these different groups of people that I was talking about. ये जो अलग-अलग groups मैंने बताया, अलग-अलग classes हैं. कुछ लोग हैं जो दूसरों के लिए मजदूरी करते हैं, कुछ लोग हैं जो मजदूरों को हायर करते हैं, कुछ लोग हैं जो अपने परिवार की मजदूरी से अपना खेती करते हैं, कुछ लोग हैं जिनके पास जमीन है, कुछ लोगों के पास जमीन नहीं है, कुछ लोगों के पास बुलक्स है, कुछ लोगों के पास बुलक्स नहीं है, किसी के पास ट्रैक्टर है, किसी के पास नहीं है. तो इस तरह के जो अलग अलग ग्रुप्स हैं, उन ग्रुप्स की डिपेंडिंग ऑन उनकी क्या रिलेशनशिप है, वो एम्प्लॉयर्स है या एम्प्लॉइज है, उनके अपने इंटरेस्ट है, और वो इंटरेस्ट दूसरे ग्रुप से कॉन्फ्लिक्ट करते हैं. उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अलग अलग क्लासेस दे हैव अ डिफरेंट स्टेक इन डेवलपमेंट. ओके, डेवलपमेंट किस तरह से हो रही है उसका अलग अलग जो क्लासेस है, अलग अलग जो ग्रुप्स है, उनका अलग अलग जो वर्ग है, उनका उसमें अलग अलग तरह का इंटरेस्ट होता है. अब कुछ परिवार है जो एफ्लुएंट है, दे डोंट हैव अ स्टेक इन पॉवर्टी एलिवेशन प्रोग्राम. कुछ परिवार ऐसे हो सकते हैं जिनके बच्चे शहरों में जाकर पढ़ रहे हैं, they don't have a stake in a village being set up in the village, a school being set up in the village. On the other hand, there will be people who are poor, who are dependent on wage labor. They may be interested in poverty alleviation program. They may be interested in having a school in the village. So, अलग-अलग तरह के लोगों का गांव में अलग-अलग इंटरेस्ट होता है डेवलपमेंट में. They have a different type of stake in development. It is because of this difference in access to means of production, difference in their relationship with labor, the fact that they have different economic status, development becomes lopsided and unequal. क्योंकि किसी के पास जमीन है, किसी के पास जमीन नहीं है. अब अगर आप वहां पर खेती को ज्यादा उपजाऊ बनाने के लिए कर्ज देना शुरू करेंगे तो जिनके पास जमीन है उनको ज्यादा फायदा होगा, जिनके पास जमीन नहीं है उनको डायरेक्टली फायदा नहीं होगा. इस तरह से आपकी जो रूरल डेवलपमेंट पॉलिसीज है वो अलग अलग जो तबके हैं उनको अलग अलग हद तक जो है फायदा पहुंचाती है. Your rural development policies benefit different sections of the society in different ways, and if your rural development policies are not balanced, then you can end up with lopsided growth, you can end up with unequal growth. You can end up with a situation where some people benefit more than others. जिनके पास पहले से जमीन है, जिनके पास ज़्यादा साधन है, वो तो विकास कर रहे हैं, जिनके पास साधन नहीं है, वो गरीब के गरीब रह जाते हैं. तो इस तरह से आपकी रूरल डेवलपमेंट का जो प्रोसेस है, that can become unequal. Second thing to understand is that because different households have different endowments, उनके जो स्टार्टिंग में जो शुरू में जो उनके एसेट्स हैं वो अलग अलग है. किसी के पास जमीन है, किसी के पास नहीं है, किसी के पास और तरह के प्रोडक्शन के साधन है, किसी के पास उत्पादन के साधन नहीं है. तो उस हिसाब से आपकी जो रूरल डेवलपमेंट पॉलिसीज है वो कुछ लोगों को फायदा पहुंचाती है और कुछ तबकों को फायदा नहीं पहुंचा रही है. तो उनका बेनिफिट जो है वो इक्वल नहीं होता है. ये जो इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रक्चर है, इसके जो अलग अलग जो क्लास स्ट्रक्चर की मैं बात कर रहा था, उस क्लास स्ट्रक्चर का एक और भी जो है असर होता है. इट हैज आल्सो हैज एन इंपॉर्टेंट बियरिंग ऑन अदर एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ डेवलपमेंट. फॉर एग्जांपल, एक्सेस टू एजुकेशन, एक्सेस टू हेल्थ केयर, बिकॉज different groups of people have different sort of controlling power on how society in the village functions. Okay, who gets benefits of different kinds of schemes, who gets different access to different kinds of facilities, who is aware of access, possibility of using some facility. आपको information नहीं है. Professor Aslam was talking about information and knowledge and communication. Access to information, you know that there is an extension officer who can provide information about what crop to grow, what fertilizer to use, what pesticide to use. A poor farmer may not have that information. Okay, so the economic structure has an important bearing on even other aspects of development like access to education and healthcare. So अगर आपका जब आप ये कोर्स खत्म करने के बाद अपने फील्ड में काम करने के लिए जाएंगे, suppose you are working with rural schools, even there economic structure is important. You have to think about whether children of agricultural workers are coming to the school, whether Dalit children are coming to the school or not. So you have to have a differentiated notion of how different sections of the rural society are getting benefits of whatever you are doing. You have a cooperative. That cooperative provides credit, suppose only to those who have some land. What about agricultural workers? Do agricultural workers get access to some benefits from this cooperative society? Do Dalits get benefits from these cooperative societies? Do women get benefits from cooperative societies? These are questions you will have to think about. These are questions that are born out of an understanding that a rural society in large parts of India, in most parts of India, is a differentiated society where there are different categories, different classes, different groups of people who don't have, it's not a homogeneous society, it's not a society where everybody is similar, everybody is same. It is a differentiated society, and it is a society in which different classes, different groups of people have conflicting interests. Okay?
Dr. Vikas, you see, I was listening to you very carefully. It's very interesting what you are saying. You talked about these assets. Assets including the means of production, and then we were talking about the relationship of household with labor and things like. You see, if you look into the situation, I'm just saying it for the sake of learners, you see the situation which exists particularly in the rural areas. We have a large chunk of people who are assetless.
Yes.
And fall, maybe somewhere at the bottom of when we are talking of poverty line, ladder or anything like that. And when we talk about this economic structure, when we try to define this economic structure, when we are talking anything about this, where do they come in? And what type of relations they can have? A person who is totally assetless, he doesn't have anything. He can only give maybe the labor, and that too is exploited from whatever way it is. So that becomes one. There's on the other side there are certain who have either it could be a land, it could be anything, any type of an asset. But those who are just at the bottom of and very vulnerable section of the society. And whenever we talk of economic, in fact, our whole development theory boils down to economics of the whole thing. how can we explain that?
Actually, let me take this opportunity to update our students on something that is there in the book that has been sent to them. This is table 4.7. When this book was written, it was based on data that were available only up to 1991. Since then, new information has become important, and I would like to use this opportunity to give our students this new information, and then also to sort of relate that to the question that you're asking. In fact, this is a question that has been answered in our text. If the camera could be focused on the presentation, this is table 4.7 in your text. It has, the table in your book has only two columns, 1981 and 1991. What I have presented here has an additional column for 2002. This is some new information that has become available. A new survey has been done by National Sample Survey Organization, and that data has become available after the text was published. So you may want to actually note this down. This table shows how the poorest 60% of households have only 15% of all assets, while the richest 10% of households have 50% of 10% of households have about 50% of all the assets. So the asset holdings are very unequally distributed. You have a very large proportion of your households which are really asset poor, which do not have assets, in particular land. Very large proportion of households do not have land. Now, I am going to give a somewhat more nuanced understanding of how to study rural economic structure. It's not merely a question of ownership of land. Land ownership is very, very important. Asset ownership is very, very important.
In conventional system,
you
we go to
land
ownership of the land and income and things like that.
Yes, but you have to actually see more than that. I will come to this. Before that, let me just sort of make my last point, which is that in India, economic structure has a very close bearing, well, let's say goes hand in hand with caste system. Caste system in rural India, the caste barriers, caste discrimination, they go hand in hand with economic deprivation. So economic deprivation in India has a very important other aspect, which is related to the caste system. Okay, I'm going to talk about that little later. Now, let me raise the second question, which relates to what you were saying, which is, okay, economic structure is important. It is important for various reasons that I talked about. How does one study economic structure? And I'm going to discuss this question in a very simple way. And my approach is the following. Suppose we go to a village. Suppose you go to a village in wherever you are situated, wherever you are based. In fact, that's a suggestion that I think, if I remember correctly, I've made in my text, is that after reading this text, you must go to a village and try and see how that rural society looks like, using the concepts that you have been exposed to in that text. That's very important, and because that's also something that you are going to do after doing this course. You will go to a village, you have to be able to implement the knowledge that you have gained, and that is the approach I am going to take when I am discussing this question, how to study the economic structure of rural society. You go to a village, what are you going to do? What are you going to look at? Okay, and I have listed three major things that we are going to look at. First is, as you were saying, distribution of land. Okay, who has land? Okay, who doesn't have land? When we say who has land, who doesn't have land, there are two types of things that we are talking about. These are again discussed in your text. One is ownership holding, which refers to land that a household owns. How much land a household owns? Who are the owners of land in the village? Okay, and how is this distributed? The largest owner of land, how much land does that person have? How many people do not have any land? How many people do not own any land? What proportion of households in the village do not own any land? These are the questions you got to ask, inquire about. Okay. The second thing is operational holding. This is a term that has been explained in the text. Operational holding refers to land that a household cultivates, operates. Okay. This may not be same as ownership holding. This may not be same as owning land. You may have a household which owns large amount of land but does not cultivate it itself, it actually leases it out. It gives it on rent. Okay, so you have tenants. Okay, you may also have a small landowning household which has mortgaged its land because it had to borrow some credit. So for various reasons, households may not cultivate the land that they own. So ownership holding is one aspect, operational holding is something somewhat different. Okay, so you look at both. Who are the owners of land? Who are the people who actually cultivate land? When I'm saying cultivate land, I'm not talking of wage workers. I'm not talking of people who cultivate land as a worker. I'm talking of people who are peasants, who are taking decisions regarding cultivation. I am cultivating wheat on my land. I decide to cultivate wheat. I decide how to cultivate it, how much seed, how much fertilizer, how much pest. I'm taking the decisions. So who are these people who are taking decisions about cultivation? That can be different from ownership of land. You can have a large landowner who has 5, 6, 10 tenants who actually do the cultivation. They give the landowner a rent. Okay, so there are two different things. But the core of this thing is that you have to look at access to land, distribution of land, ownership of land, how these are distributed, how many households have land, how many households do not have land, and how equally or unequally is land distributed. Why land? Because as I said earlier, land is the most important means of production. Okay, economic power in an Indian village first and foremost derives from ownership of land. Land gives you social status, land gives you economic status. So land is very, very important. Okay, so to start with, look at land. How is land distributed? Second is look at other assets. Okay, how are other assets distributed? Okay, look at total asset holding. If you look at the text that has been provided to you, there is a section on assets. In fact, I've updated one of the tables just now. How many households have productive assets? How many households do not have productive assets? How are assets distributed in the village? Okay, just now we said about 10% of richest households have about 50% of assets. Okay, you can see this in a village. How in a village ownership of particularly productive assets is distributed. Okay, land, tractors, plows, bullocks. How, if you value all the productive assets, how are they distributed? Who has them? Okay. A related aspect to assets is indebtedness of households, the credit, the debt. That is, how indebted are households. You may have a household which has some assets, but actually has debts which far much higher than the assets that it owns. The level of it may be deeply in debt. Okay, you may have a household which neither has assets but has huge amount of debt. So your economic capability is measured on one hand by the amount of assets, wealth you have, in particular productive wealth, and on the other hand the debt that you have, the borrowings, the credit that you have taken. Okay, who are the people who have higher debts? Okay. Secondly, where is this credit coming from? Who are the lenders? Are these banks, cooperatives, or these are village money lenders, or is it actually a landlord in the village, okay, a landowner in the village, or friends and relatives, or traders? What is the source of finance in the village? What is the source of credit for different types of people in the village, different classes of people? Who do agricultural workers borrow from? Who do peasants borrow from? Where does the landlord get its credit from? Okay, where does the capitalist big farmer get its credit from? These are the questions that you got to ask. Finally, and most importantly, and this is the core aspect, is to understand the labor process. Okay, who provides labor and in what way? You got to identify each household in terms of following three groups. Whether the household employs family labor for cultivation of land, okay, whether the household uses any family labor, okay, if they have any land, do they cultivate it? Do they put any family labor on it? The third thing to look for is whether the household hires labor. Okay, do they use a wage laborer? Do they hire daily workers, piece-rated workers for doing specific tasks? Say harvesting has to be done, they pay somebody who comes and does harvesting for them, or a group of workers, men and women, who come and do harvesting for the household. So you hire workers. The third thing is whether members of this household themselves work as wage workers. That is, they they labor on somebody else's farm. So there are three things. One, whether I put labor on my own farm or not, whether I hire workers from outside or not, and finally whether I go to work for somebody else or not. Okay, so these are three different possibilities in the labor process. Okay, and within the class of wage workers, you would have people who work as agricultural workers, and people who work as non-agricultural workers, and people who do all sorts of different things, both agricultural and non-agricultural work. So there are people who there are three different aspects to labor process: provision of family labor, hiring of labor, and hiring out of labor, working as a wage worker. Okay, there are these three things. Now, once you understand these three aspects, that is land, debt and asset, and finally the labor process, you can ask a set of questions. For example, are there any households that own large amount of land but do not labor on their own land? They have land, but they don't work on that land. They don't cultivate it themselves. They don't, or even when they are actually cultivating themselves, they don't actually do the work. They hire workers. They don't put any family labor, or very small amounts of family labor. Their cultivation is not really based on family labor at all, and normally such people would have large amount of labor. There can be some exceptions to this. You can have, for example, widows in the village who have small plots of land. They don't have enough physical capability to do their own labor, so they lease it out to somebody, or they bring in somebody. Leave aside those people who out of distress are not, who don't have the capability, physical capability to cultivate their own land. Are there people who have large amount of land, have physical capability but don't do it because they are affluent, they are rich, they don't want to do manual labor? Okay, are there such households? That would be a class, that would be a group. Normally such a group will be called landlords. They could be capitalist landlord, they could be pre-capitalist landlord, but that's the term that is typically used for such people who have large amount of land but don't do their own labor. Then, are there any rich peasant households, and I am introducing a term here, rich peasants, which operate substantial amount of land, but the difference between them and landlords is they use some family labor, but they also mainly depend on hired labor. The difference from landlords is they use some family labor here. They do not labor on other people's land, nor do they do any non-agricultural manual work. Okay, so these are households that do not work on other people's land. These are households that hire workers. They also do a little bit of family labor. They have land. Okay, are there households like this in the village that you have gone to? Third, are there any medium peasants who have land? They use substantial amount of family labor. They also use substantial amount of hired labor. Okay, they don't work on other people's land. Sometimes a little bit of labor they may do, but they are largely self-sufficient. Their own land gives them enough livelihood. They basically depend on that. They use some hired labor, they use some family labor, and that's how they pull along. Finally, are there any poor peasants? And who are these poor peasants? These people have small amount of land. They cultivate them primarily using their own labor. Okay, they may hire a little bit of labor at specific points of time. Harvesting has to be done quickly in a short span of time. They don't have too many workers at home, so they hire one or two workers. But by and large, cultivation is done using their own labor. They may also be working as wage labor to earn additional income. In addition to earnings that they get from their small plots of land, they may have to do some wage labor to earn some additional income. And finally, in the village, is there a class of manual workers, who do not own any land? They have no land, they don't have very much of means of production, and they solely depend on wage labor. Now, what are these kinds of wage workers? You have to see what occupations they do. What are the occupations they are engaged in? How much employment they get in agriculture? How much employment they get in non-agricultural jobs? Do they work as construction workers? Do they work in the nearby urban areas? What kind of jobs do they do? Okay, how much employment do they get? This is a group of households whose welfare, whose economic well-being solely depends on wage employment. And therefore you got to look at how much employment they get, how much wages do they get, how much are their earnings.
Now one thing here, Dr. Vikas, what I was saying that I could see that you are saying that for the learners that if you have to study the economic structure, essentially you have laid down 4 things: the land distribution, the asset distribution in that particular village, the credit and debts, whatever the situation is, and finally the labor process. Now you see what happens that we have students also. We have a large number of students, as I told you, who are very freshers, fresh to even coming from a science stream and things like that, very fresh to the whole social sciences. And you know, if you ask them, what they will be doing, I think traditionally if you have to prepare a questionnaire, the first question perhaps you will prepare is, what is the monthly income? What is that? You see, when we are talking of these things, what is the scope of preparing a sort of an economic, picture of a particular village? If they go to a study, apart from these things, have they to also ask them something like, how can they measure where these income groups are and things like that? Can that be also a part of the whole study of the economic study?
You see, this is income.
I'm trying to make it simple.
Yes, income. See, let me first make it clear. Okay, most of the rural households are not salaried employees. They don't have a regular monthly income. You ask them what is their monthly income, they are going to be baffled. They'll give you, either they will be totally baffled or they will give you an answer which will be absurd.
So you have to arrive at.
So you have to, calculate their incomes, and that calculation is going to be difficult. That calculation is not easy for most of the rural households, be it agricultural workers or a large landowning household.
So we have to come out of that fallacy of asking a straight question. What is your income? And normally, in 90% of the case, we don't get the reply, and then we say, no, he's hiding or he is doing something.
No. In fact, I must tell you, I've done a lot of surveys, and I must say that peasants in this country are fantastic on this. They tell you what you want. Okay, they tell you if you ask
the right
question.
They have the wisdom.
Their wisdom, and they're very cooperative. They trust you if you are sincere. You go sincerely, ask them, they will tell you. A lot of questions that if somebody came to me and asked, I perhaps will not answer. Okay, somebody came and asked me all sorts of questions about my employment and income. I actually may not answer those questions, but I will. Trust me. You go to a village and you ask a villager, they will tell you. Just make sure that your questions are correct. Don't ask a question like this: what is your monthly income? He doesn't have a regular monthly income.
What should our
you got to ask? What is the wage you get every day? Okay, how many days do you work in harvesting? How many days do you work in weeding? You have to go there as a learner. Okay, you have to first learn, and mind you, an agricultural worker in the village knows hell of a lot. Okay, you have to first learn from that person. You are a student. Okay, go as a student, don't go as a teacher, don't go as a practitioner, go as a student. First learn how agriculture happens in this village. What are the crops grown? How is wheat cultivated? How is rice cultivated? Okay, then ask them, okay, in cultivation of rice, workers are hired for, say, transplanting, for weeding, for harvesting, for threshing. Now on each of these, how many days of work do you get? How much wage do you get? And then make a calculation, how much does this person earn from working as a wage worker in rice.
So essentially what we are telling students, that you ask those questions which you have rightly said, that what is your wage per day, how many days of wage employment you get, how many people in your households are getting this type of a wage, and then arrive at the income, rather than asking what is sort of that which has come for, and we don't reach anywhere, and we say, well, it doesn't take us anywhere.
Keep in mind that your ultimate objective is to find out income. So you ask those questions, and you see the labor process is very, very complex. There will be various ways in which workers are hired. Sometimes they are not even given a daily wage. There is a piece rated work. You do 1 acre of harvesting, you will get so much. You ask them how many days you work. I don't know how many days I work, but I did 5 acres of harvesting, and for each acre of harvesting I got 3 bags of wheat. Okay. But you have to make a calculation. It would be possible for you to make a calculation, remain sensitive, be clear about what you are trying to get, and ask the right question. You will be able to get it. It's difficult. It will take time. Be patient. Okay. Ask patiently. But it's very fruitful exercise. It's a very interesting exercise. It's a very good learning experience to go to 2, 3, 4, 5 rural households and ask them about their income. Okay, but ask detailed questions, and that's how you would learn how rural houses actually make their living.
Does it also is necessary for our learners that before they ask these questions, they will have to prepare, they have to understand first the
very much.
economic structure.
Very
because
much.
That also, in what I have seen, and I want to tell our learners, without going into the details, without themselves understanding, we go in a stereotype of a thing. The moment you have to do a project work, you start getting questions from here and there, pick up questions from there and there, and then go unprepared. As a result, you don't get. Although it is in the second semester that you will be doing the dissertation and things like that, it may take you another 6 to 8 months to reach there. But from the very beginning, if you are planning to have your research work in studying any economic aspect, you have to understand that economic aspect. What Dr. Rawat is saying, please.
Yeah, you have to sort of start with, let us say, the text that has been provided. Then you have to first go to a village and learn how that agriculture in that village works before you actually start your formal inquiry.
That's right. That's right.
So you have to first gather a set of basic information and then you go on. Now,
one thing which I would like that, it's a topic, you can, it's an endless topic. I was interested that, what we are talking about when we talk about, the rural areas, when we talk about the economics and things like that, apart from what you have rightly given them in that, we would also, perhaps be interested, because many things have happened between this preparation. What are the recent trends when we are talking about this rural employment and things like that, as taking rural India as our context?
You see, there are well, this is something that's been discussed in the text, but I would like to sort of give our students some summary of what has been happening. You see, on employment, there are two sort of major phases in recent times. The first was, let us say, the 1980s, the decade of 1980s. It was a period in which government started a whole range of employment generation programs, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, IRDP, etc., etc. There were mainly of two types. One where
wage employment, the other one was self-employment.
Where an asset was given for people to get some self-employed, some earnings of their own, or a wage employment task was organized where people came and they were hired and work was organized. Now, this was a period over which there was actually a substantial employment growth, with the effect of, and this was largely an effect of these employment generation programs, also an effect of other sort of government-led investments in rural areas. Various kinds of government programs, various kinds of
infrastructure development
programs. Now, if you look at the data, it shows that, let us say, between 1983 and 1993, the NSSO data show that by usual status, the employment grew at about 1.75% per annum. Now, I will not go into definition of what is usual status. It's defined in great detail in the text. Please read it. It by and large refers to people who are usually employed, people who are employed for at least half of the year. So, such employment growth refers to growth of such numbers that grew annually by about 1.75% per annum. Then you come into 1990s. 1990s was a period in which such public government-led programs were actually withdrawn to an extent. They declined, and this was a period over which also the employment elasticity of agricultural growth declined. That is, for let us say every 1% rise in agricultural production, the percentage rise in employment generation used to be about 0.7. Now that fell to about 0.1. So agricultural growth became less and less employment generated. So agriculture's contribution to generation of employment started declining. As a result, in the 1990s, the employment growth has actually fallen very sharply in rural areas to about 0.66%. So now, since you are
talking about this, you are talking about these programs which were introduced from. Now, the latest thing, perhaps I don't know whether we have mentioned it in our the written material or not. We have this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So much is talked about this. And as you said, we had earlier both wage and self-employment schemes. How do you view that? To what extent it carries that potential of bringing that guarantee in the rural employment?
You see, I think National Rural Employment Guarantee Program is a very promising program. It's a very sort of promising break that has been made from the past approaches to both poverty alleviation and employment. So particularly in terms of financial resources that have been
kept at the
disposal of the scheme, there's not too much of a rise. There is some rise, but that's not the major point. What has been done is that whole lot of other schemes have now been amalgamated into NREGA, this new scheme. So it's not all the old schemes have been now sort of made a part of this. Well, most of them. So the whole effort is now sort of through one scheme, and therefore there's not such a huge jump in financial resources as of now. But the interesting part is that this scheme, as against the previous one, provides a guarantee of employment. That is, in about 100 districts where it has been started until now, you are saying that anybody who applies for employment under the scheme will be given 100 days of employment. That is, every household that applies will get 100 days of employment at the minimum wages. Okay, so firstly, it's not about white collar jobs. It's not about even blue collar jobs. It's about manual work. It's about digging ponds, making roads, that kind of work. People who have no sort of regular employment, people have no other assets to sort of get earnings from. The poorest of the poor will only go for this. This is not something where the rich people like you or me would want to anyway.
Tell me one thing. I mean, we are just coming because the time constraint and things like that. Does it hold that potential to guarantee?
Well,
without going into details.
It depends on implementation, of course. It of course depends on implementation, how well it's implemented, how many people actually apply, how well can you how transparent is the whole implementation, how well can you ensure that everybody who applies but does not get employment gets the unemployment allowance. But you see, in principle, it is a scheme that has the idea that employment is a right, and everybody can ask for employment. Now it is for us, people like you, people like me, our students who when they go to work in the rural areas, to ensure that these schemes come into operation and their benefits go to people who they are targeted at.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vikas, for being with us this afternoon. I know this is a topic which needs a lot more time. I hope we will have many more occasions to discuss this further. Thank you very much for being with us. And dear learners, we'll be meeting you again in the next session next month. Thank you very much for being with us.